Welcome to the Need to Know podcast, the world's leading podcast on dual-use technology and pressing topics in national security across AUKUS, NATO, and beyond. In this episode, BOKA CEO John James and operating partner Teresa Smetzer sat down with John Sherman, the former Department of Defense Chief Information Officer and current Dean of the Bush School at Texas A&M. In this episode, you'll hear about the types of initiatives Dean Sherman hopes to accomplish at the Bush School, the role of technology in public policy, collaboration across AUKUS and its allies, beating bureaucracy in defense, and more.
Hi, I'm Teresa Smetzer. I'm an operating partner at BOKA Capital, and I'm a retired CIA executive.
Hi, or as we'd say here at Texas A&M University, howdy. I'm John Sherman, Dean of the Bush School of Government Public Service, founded by President George H.W. Bush in 1997, where one of our primary focuses is getting leaders ready for our community, state, nation, and the world.
Hi, I'm John James. I'm the founding CEO of BOKA Capital, and we are a deep tech dual-use investor.
Terrific. So, John, let me get started by congratulating you on your appointment at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M. It's an incredible opportunity, and they are very fortunate to have you, given your broad background in Department of Defense, the intelligence community, and the U.S. Army. So, with that background, what are your thoughts on sort of initiatives, programs, issues that you want to lead the Bush School? What sorts of things do you want to undertake?
Well, thank you, Teresa, and it's an honor to be here with you. One of the main initiatives overall I want to continue is exactly what President Bush set us on the course to do. One of the main quotes we have is public service is a noble calling. That President Bush said this when he was alive and here. And so the world continues to evolve and change. We just have to pick up anything, whether reading on our phones or the paper, about how the global environment is changing. And I want to ensure that we're preparing our students for all echelons of leadership. Could be resolving problems here within the state of Texas that require attention, for our nation, be it in national security or other types of administration, and also on the world stage. One area that I know we've worked together, Teresa, is on areas of technology, the emergence of AI, how technology is going to influence so many parts of public policy, whether it's areas like cyber, whether it's areas like one of our institutes is looking at small modular nuclear reactors and the public policy implications of that, or just what we're seeing, for example, in the Mideast right now on how technology is redefining warfare. We need public policy leaders that are going to be prepared for all of those areas.
Thank you so much, John. So the last 4 years for U.S. public service execution have been quite a challenge between COVID, conflict in Russia and the Ukraine, the Israel-Hamas situation, tensions with China. Also, all of the issues associated with public sector workforce, which you and I have dealt with in the past, and the increasing reliance for the government on the private sector companies, investment organizations, and so on. What's interesting to me is your role as DoD CIO. You were successful despite the challenges that really have faced the public sector in the last few years. Tell me a little bit about what you think. Why were you so successful? What was it that made you different?
Well, I had a great team around me. When I say team, not only at DOD, but working, for example, with our colleagues at CIA and CloudWorks and in the Information Technology Enterprise, the CIO organization there, working with industry. For example, all four of the major hyperscaler cloud service providers and other parts of the tech industry as well, working with allies, the Five Eyes allies in the UK, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the US. It requires a team of teams, but also having a very clear vision about what we want to do. Teresa, on the way over here, we talked about the decision to cancel the JEDI cloud contract several years ago and moving to the Joint Warfighting Cloud capability, which was a multi-cloud, multi-vendor approach. That, to me, capitalized on the best practices of a team of teams, getting all four of the CSPs to lean in, but also making sure Secretary Lloyd Austin, Secretary of Defense, and the other key stakeholders director of national intelligence and others were behind what we were doing. I found being a technology leader, just as you have done in private sector and in government, requires personal invested leadership. Yes, it's about the technology. Yes, it's about hyperscale technology and cybersecurity and zero trust and all that, but it comes down to leadership, which is what I want to make sure we can prepare our students for at the Bush School of Government and Public Service, that you need to know the technology, but you better be able to work across with different stakeholder groups to get the job done.
Thank you.
Great. And John, you sort of touched on Five Eyes, and obviously there's other alliances that we're all collectively members of, like NATO as well. But as you're more than aware, in September 21 started the trilateral security partnership between Australia, the UK, and the US, i.e. AUKUS. And I guess this was originally intended really to promote that deeper information and technology sharing beyond submarines, with the goal of strengthening each government's own security and defense interests. Now, BOKA, our investment thesis is really based on leveraging this agreement to invest not only in deep tech, but more specifically around dual use technologies across those countries. And so what I'm interested in is, based on your experience to date, how critical is this partnership to addressing some of those needs? And sort of where do you see that moving going forward?
So, John, I want to thank you for what you all are doing to enable and encourage and empower the investment going on in that area. As the DoD CIO, I was obviously very involved in this. Not only there was the track one piece you noted about the submarines, and then track two is we're looking at cyber and technologies and other areas there, which I see, of course, the submarines are going to be critical. And there's a reason the PRC is so worried about this, to be able to have the allied partners leveraging the nuclear submarine technology, but also for cyber and other areas. I think it is so important, and I think this harkens to the best spirit of what we've been able to do together as allied nations, dating back to World War II. There's a lot of pick and shovel work that has to go in. Having IT systems, not only at the secret but top secret level, where engineers and others can exchange information. As CIO, I had to work through a lot of issues on this that were not glamorous. And this is back to my time as the intelligence community CIO, even predating AUKUS, on areas like policies on break and inspect, on moving data packets between sovereign boundaries, things that should be easier than they are, but aren't. And this is why, back to the relationship with my colleague CIOs in London and Canberra, and for that matter, in Ottawa and Wellington as well, as we work through some of those hard issues. What excites me too about AUKUS, and this is well above my pay grade on some of the policy issues, but the interest in Tokyo and Seoul in being kind of extended members, and maybe even in New Delhi, on what we're doing as like-minded democracies to stand up against frankly, predatory activity by the PRC and bringing the best of breed technologies. But my takeaway here is the vision's great, but the hard pick and shovel work that has to be done cannot be ignored. And I want to thank you all for helping us get to the technologies and the processes to be successful in that area.
Terrific. To that end, John, you and I have had a lot of experience collaborating on bureaucracy and sort of thinking differently about how to do business. So what are some things based on your experience in DoD that you think we could do bureaucratically to ease some of the resistance to this sort of collaboration? And how can you help also from the Bush School at putting in place some policies that might promote that sort of engagement?
So a few things here. I think working with the folks that are not the technologists, the folks in general counsel, the people that work in contracts and acquisition, they've got to be brought into the discussion. I'll use an example. When we were getting ready on the Joint Warfighting Cloud Capability contract, this is the $9 billion ceiling contract that replaced JEDI. There were a lot of stakeholders involved, and the technologists certainly understood what was needed, but I needed help from the folks working the non-material issues. So I stood up an informal group, somewhat half-jokingly called the Council of Elders, that I would bring together because I needed the senior executive level deciders, not the folks further down doing the contract and procurement, hardworking women and men, don't get me wrong, but I needed the deciders at the table who could break through and say, there's a timeline we're on. We need the lawyers to get to yes on this. We need to work with our intelligence community counterparts to be able to get to yes on use of existing infrastructure. That's what I had to do. And I want that kind of lesson or set of lessons is what I want to imbue in the Bush School of Government Public Service. That there's kind of the textbook way to do things, but then there's the how you get things actually done. And one of the ways we try to do that in the Bush School of Government and Public Service is, in addition to our outstanding tenure track professors, we have what are called professors of the practice. These are men and women that come from places like CIA, FBI, Department of Defense, and they come with practical experience of how you get things done. If I can use a quick example, there's the 1986 movie called Back to School with Rodney Dangerfield. And there's a scene I love where he's in a business class and there's kind of the textbook way of setting up a business, but Rodney Dangerfield's character had run a clothing store for decades in New York. And he starts talking about what he had to actually do with, the getting contracts in place and so on. And the students are all turning around, taking notes from him. And not to take away again from our tenure track, but the professors of practice really are our secret sauce at the Bush School, trying to work through that. So that was the first half of the question. Remind me of the second half there, please, Teresa.
Well, it's just the bureaucracy more generally.
Yeah.
I mean, one example, the U.S. recently removed ITAR requirements for AUKUS members. That's an example of something that was extremely impactful because the bureaucracy behind ITAR and applying for ITAR is tremendous. So that helps to enable then more free-flowing. So other examples of where we could do things like that.
I think this gets to the personal relationships, and you don't want to make it the quote-unquote buddy net, but it can't be completely dependent on the incumbents in the jobs. But man, is that important to be able to pick up the phone or get on email because of the time differences and things and talk to my counterpart in Canberra or in London or get on a quick call and say, we've got to be able to work this together in the U.S. with our interagency partners, in London, across the different organizations and so on. Because if you try to let the bureaucracy just run, it's going to take years and years. And the concern that would keep me up, you kind of got to get to the why on this too, is as we are working together as allies against authoritarian nations, be they in Beijing, Tehran, Moscow, or Pyongyang, they're able to move quicker because of their authoritarian nature. Not that we ever want to not have our democratic groundings, our free market economies, but when Xi says, I want 10 data centers built next week, guess what's going to get built? 10 data centers, in a month or what have you. We've got to be able to move with that same alacrity, but with undergirding our democratic values, free market economy, free and fair competition, and as allies, but in a way that we can stay ahead of our authoritarian competitors, which is why, by the way, the sort of investments you all are making and your advocacy is so important. And this also is not just in governmental channels, it's with industry. Our colleague, John Edwards, who I think of often, he was the CIO at CIA for years and the deputy chief operating officer. I learned a lot from him about how he could just pick up the phone and call Amazon, AWS, or he could call, another company. And I learned a lot from that is don't demur from those relationships. Stay free and stay within the bounds of the contract, but lean into it. And not just in the U.S., these companies want to help. And I don't think you'd mind me quoting him. Satya Nadella at Microsoft said, look, we all live here. Our kids are under the same threat of terrorists or what may happen. And that is a powerful influence. Yeah, they may be economic competitors, but picking up the phone and say, let's help us break through this. That's something I tried to do as CIO.
Yeah. Thanks. So just picking up on that, obviously you sort of alluded to speed being one of our sort of critical abilities, I suppose, to try and stay ahead of adversaries, but also the nature of some of the technologies is going to be important as well, particularly where there's IP that we've developed that they haven't, or that we're slightly more advanced in our capabilities. So I guess moving forward, and you'll have seen a lot of stuff come across your desk at the DoD and in your previous roles as well. Where do you see technologies and national security headed more generally? And what are, I guess, some of the new frontiers for that type of tech? So, for example, space is an important domain now. It's something that we weren't really talking about a lot maybe 5-10 years ago, and it's obviously of interest to our adversaries as well. But other areas now where, for example, in from a defense perspective, warfighting is morphing as well. So where sort of classic guns and bullets are moving across to things like theft or control of IP, financial threat between states and non-state actors. The lines are blurring between, I guess, defense, national security, and commerce in that respect. Do we need to, I guess, reimagine our defense to counter these threats? Are the lines between our traditional agencies blurring as a consequence? Where do you see it all going, basically?
Absolutely. And it's the speed of not only what I talked about, but the developments you just touched on, John, as we look across and all sorts of things. There's pagers blowing up on Hezbollah members' hips. There's drones being used by both sides of the conflict in Ukraine every day, and electronic countermeasures being deployed on almost daily existential basis. We just had Senator Rob Portman here yesterday. We have the Mossbacher Institute at the Bush School of Government Public Service. And Senator Portman, who's been a strong ally of Ukraine, was just in Lviv and Kiev this past week, and saw in a room about the size of the studio we're in, I know you can't see it all here, but there were young men and women developing drones in real time for deployment. It just cuts to the nature of warfare and how quick it's changing. To your question about, and some of these trends are well known among many of your audience, and certainly you all. At the Bush School, we're thinking a lot about artificial intelligence, and not just Gen AI and how that helps with research and so on, but how it's going to fundamentally change the nature of so many things. You mentioned space. That is so critical. I mean, we see not only what's going on proliferated low Earth orbit constellations. I mean, we had the first non-NASA extravehicular activity this past week. If that didn't give you goosebumps with those civilian astronauts standing out on the deck of that SpaceX capsule, my goodness. And at the same time, we recognize it's still a challenging environment. Starliner did touch down successfully, but there's still 2 U.S. astronauts on the ISS for good, safe reasons that they were kept up there. And then, of course, we talk so much about cyber, but we've had the CrowdStrike issue here just recently, and talking about how there is still pushing the rock up the hill about getting not only private sector, but even government entities to take this seriously, that this is existential. There are other areas too, as we look at technological developments, which start to get into some of the AUKUS track too, whether it's hypersonic technology, autonomous vehicles. Here at Texas A&M, not at the Bush School, but we have what's called our RELIS campus. That's the former Bryan Air Force Base, where, by the way, Buzz Aldrin trained when he was a fighter pilot. We have a statue of him out there. It stands for our core values at A&M: respect, excellence, leadership, loyalty, integrity, and selfless service. But this former military air base, we have the Bush Combat Development Center, which is not affiliated with our school for which I'm the dean, but we're testing things like hypersonics, 5G, 6G, next technology, and our Army Futures Command is out there. And the reason I note this is this gets to the quick development and I see the marriage of industry, government, and academia needing to work together. And the next layer on that, John, I would say, is with our allies. And I think there's already good connective tissue, but that's the one thing that's hard, is staying in formation with allies. And it's a bias for communicate. You can almost over communicate. Secretary Lloyd Austin, SecDef, former boss, would say you cannot over communicate in the world we live in. And that's one thing I want to try to do too, to make sure we're moving things along.
Great. And so look, you just mentioned, you refer to Ukraine and an example there. And obviously there are more recent examples as well, such as some of the activity in the Black Sea and elsewhere. And these essentially are all providing us real-time lessons certainly from a DoD and allied sort of defense perspective. What might you see as some of the significant learnings that are coming out of some of these military engagements?
I think there's so many, John. I think as you mentioned, with drone technology, electronic warfare, things like positioning, navigation, and timing, or PNT, and the role of GPS, and there's others, BIDOW and other systems on orbit that provide that. But how the 21st century way of war is happening, and it's happening quickly. And we have Houthis firing missiles into the Red Sea, and with our U.S. and allied navies trying to thwart their missile strikes. We're seeing all types of new technologies not only being used in Ukraine, but as China is trying to push on the South China Sea and elsewhere. So my takeaways from this are, it's kind of like former Deputy U.S. Secretary of Defense Bob Work would talk about, with these very quick turn, sort of software enabled, DevSecOps enabled, uh, uh, the future is here sort of technologies. And we see this as the civilian operations in space happening, the commoditization of what had been very classified capabilities on orbit. And my worry is, now that I'm in academia getting the next generation ready, is that we're not wedded to old ways of doing business. And we have men and women who are prepared to think, whether they're studying the humanities or studying foreign affairs, that digital capabilities have to be front of mind, in the same way that new technologies in World War II were front of mind with radar and sonar, nuclear capabilities. And I'm failing in my job as dean if we're not ensuring that is injected into our curricula. So these are the kind of things that really do keep me up as a dean, preparing a next generation of leaders, that we're not falling behind on thinking about how technology is going to work on the battlefield.
And just to follow up on that, I think I totally agree with everything you've said. I think what's interesting is that we also then have to think about, how does procurement change, for example. The US has been particularly good, I think, at a lot of its research and development financing across particularly the military and intelligence community, and a relatively agile mode of granting contracts, and it's created some new contract regimes that have helped. It's been more open to allies contracting as well, which I think is extremely helpful. But I don't know if you've got any thoughts on how maybe that could be improved, that sort of side of procurement, and sort of modernized effectively.
Well, watching my colleague at the Pentagon, Undersecretary for Acquisition Sustainment, Bill LaPlante, going to NATO allied nations and going to Brussels for the armaments chiefs conferences, and watching not only in the U.S. but the UK and other allies ramping up production of long range fires and other Stinger missiles and Storm Shadows and ATACMS and other terms you would hear, and also not just the big end items, but the piece parts that go into those. This is one thing I actually talked about on my interview for the dean job. I haven't had a chance to really lean into this yet, but I'll give you a little preview here. I think this is almost its own tradecraft of thinking about procurement as an arsenal of democracy, where you have a country like Ukraine on a front line, and we as AUKUS and other allies are providing capabilities, again, not just missiles and fighters and so on, but technological capability. It's its own way to think about this. And as we've ramped up production plants here in the U.S., it was scary in 2022 when I'd be in meetings hearing about how long it takes to make a Javelin missile. And we had one play. We stopped the Stinger line. As a former air defense officer, I didn't know that Stinger missiles weren't being made anymore. And there was one factory that does the rocket motor. And, you're thinking, oh my Lord, I've heard a peace dividend, and I know we've been fighting Al Qaeda and ISIS and others for the last, and continue to do so. But in a way, that's the only kind of the horrible tragedy in Ukraine, the wake-up call that this brought to NATO and our Asian allies, that we have got to think much differently, to your point, John, about procurement, and also for these very high-tech items. This isn't World War II, where, God forbid, we were losing Spitfire fighters and P-51 Mustangs and Sherman tanks and Cromwell tanks and all that, and we could turn these out relatively. An F-35 fighter is going to take a while to come off the line. How the modern howitzers take a year or more to get built, and it's not just the electronic parts; it's the barrels. And my point is, it's shown us like, oh my goodness, if we have to do something against China someday or another regional scenario, we better think in a way we haven't thought about these items and be able to move quickly, because we're not going back to dropping dumb bombs again. We have to have the precision and the digital undergirding of it. So that's just what I've been thinking about for my job and now into my current one.
Just a related question, John, is procurement's obviously important, but so is risk management and coming up with more transparent but aggressive ways of thinking about whether it's security or counterintelligence or how we engage across our foreign partners. What that risk management piece has always been, as you know, tricky.
That's a great point, Teresa. And I just had a cadet from the Texas A&M Corps Cadets who's about to be an Air Force acquisition officer come to my office for mentoring. And we talked about this very thing in my experience in the Pentagon, where there is the concern I have, and I think this cross-cuts allied capitals as well. You're in an assignment in the military for 3 years or so, and there is a high risk if you get too bold on something and you overstep a bound, this can ruin your career. There's not the opportunity cost out there that we would sometimes see from maybe positions like you all are in, or maybe like I'm in academia, where the going by the rules and playing super slow is going to, yes, be the safe route, but we're not going to be able to deliver on time. There was just a government accountability office report here in the U.S. on something near and dear to my heart, and this gets to your question here about global positioning system M or military code receivers in the U.S. and also for our allies. This sounds very technical, but this is what gets the most secure GPS code into the cockpit or the bridge of the ship. And this is one thing as CIO, I was just pulling my hair out on, trying to accelerate the acquisition and bringing not only industry, but program managers and others. And they're working hard, patriotic Americans working hard with allies and others. But it kind of got to, I read a great article about what Gwen Shotwell and her team are doing down at Boca Chica. I bet she's a personal friend of yours, where the launch director, whose name escapes me, down at Boca Chica said, we operate as though the world is ending in 8 days. Now, that's kind of almost an Elon kind of little bit of tongue in cheek, but I think we have got to change in some ways that and I used to, in some of these meetings for dramatic effect, I'd say, pretend Paul Nakasoni's folks, NSA, came with a piece of signal intelligence, said, we have reliable intelligence that the Chinese are going to attack on 1 March of next year. Absolutely ironclad, just hypothetical. Or the Russians are going to attack Poland, or I can go down a list. Iran is going to attack Saudi Arabia or something. And we know it's going to happen. All right, acquisition people, what would you do then? Would you send extra people to the factories? Would you work with the lawyers and say, we've got to get to yes? Or would you work all through the night on a new contract? I mention all this because not for only dramatic effect, but I think we're still too much in a peacetime mode when the world we live in is a very almost wartime footing, and we're seeing it all around. So that is how I try to approach that as CIO.
Great answer.
Thank you.
So, John, we've talked a little bit about the increasing dependence that the public sector has on private capital, private companies, private innovation at universities. How can we accelerate really leveraging private capital, whether it's venture capital, private equity, individual wealth, which is as we've discussed, quite prominent in Texas. How do we tap into that as a more effective way of another vector to get to the preparation that we need to have?
I think, Teresa, your career and what you've done is perfectly emblematic of how do we approach that, where you've spent many years doing intelligence work, then you went out to the private sector, and then doing what was truly one of the most noble givebacks, coming back up to Virginia to run Digital Futures in our Directorate of Digital Innovation. It gets down to having individuals who know how to operate in this space. This is one thing. I gave an earlier interview this past week about mid-career development, so on. I still believe the IC and DoD are not thinking widely enough. And yes, there's internships and hostage swaps and sending people to industry. But I think we've got to do even more to be able to have folks in seats like I used to be in, being able to understand how private capital works. Teresa, you brought that. I remember sitting around that, we were talking about that conference table on the ground floor at CIA there. I can't remember the number, 3G, whatever it was. But you would bring that insight into our discussion about how we're going to leverage technology at speed of mission. And so there are a number of efforts underway, and what you all are doing right now, I think, is critical. And I think it gets back to the relationships, being able to have these sort of contacts and making sure that the government side is not in a paradigm lock, that the private investment side also knows the problems, or not problems, but the opportunities and challenges we may need help with from a mission perspective, and then being able to talk across without having things like classification and all that come to the fore. And it's not easy, because if you just let the system run, uh, taking your hand off the steering wheel, then the walls are going to come up. The issues about opportunity cost, where I don't have anything. If I just kind of stay in my little foxhole here, no sweat off my back. It's going to take some folks who are like, hey, I want to go down to Austin and go talk to some folks. I want to go to London and hear from some companies. It's going to go out to Silicon Valley and even places we're not thinking of right now. But you got to have connectors to you. And you all are connectors, I would say. And I think without that, it's going to be very hard to do. And I think we need it across the allied capitals, which we're seeing right now, but this is going to be critical to have.
Yeah, just to elaborate on that, I also think the relationship with organizations like BOKA, Capital, are less about sort of arm's length, and more about how do we engage so that we can be better representatives, better advocates of what government needs with industry, and invest in things that really matter, and not things that may make money, but the goal is to make money and help with security. And so it's a different type of relationship than I think what we've seen in the past, where it was arm's length.
And what can be done from the private investment side too? And it's not just the money piece; it's the vision, it's the knowing what's out there is sometime in the confines of government, and whether it's in the Pentagon or Ministry of Defense over at Whitehall, or at CIA at Langley. Sometime we can get our heads down, pencils up sort of mentality, because we've got mission requirements. The seventh floor is calling us for a briefing. We've got a real world operation underway, and yes, we may have some visits here and there, but sometime we can get paradigm lock on some things and not realize there's a new opportunity on new technology, because you all have talked to a company and name your location, and there's an opportunity for us to do things in the space realm, in the autonomous vehicle realm, and in something that'll leap us over into 6G and next G in a way we're not even thinking of, that our officers can benefit from doing clandestine operations next month or next year and not in 10 years. That's the biggest problem I found. A lot of us in national security, I think, are kind of fully invested, not kind of. I mean, we're all alpha. What am I trying to say? Full extrovert, leaning into the problem and going to work the 12-hour days. But sometimes we can have blinders on if we don't take the time to go out and do some outreach with connectors like you all. And that's the big risk that we always have to check ourselves on. And that's what I want the students to hear too. And I told that cadet who's going into acquisition, be careful about getting down and not listening to what's going on around you.
Yeah, just one of the things I saw running digital futures quite often was what I'll call the sort of crisis of imagination.
Yes.
People think about linear evolution of what we've always done. We need, to your
Yep.
point about the interview earlier in the week you did on human capital management, this isn't about evolving the way we manage human capital. This is about reimagining, right? That's scary to people, but yet that's where relationships between the investment community, your new role at the Bush School here, how do you help the government think about reimagining things, not just extending the same old, same old. And that is scary for a lot of government folks.
It is, because there's a lot of risk involved in that. And I remember when we were working in digital innovation together with Andrew and Sean and the team there, I thought we did a good job of integrating a fail fast sort of attitude. And I know in business, you all have done that too, that yes, we don't want negligence or laziness or whatever, but we want our thought leaders to be able to try new things and not get punished if they don't work out. And unfortunately, in a lot of sectors of government, that is, you screw up once and then you're done.
Right.
And it's like I saw a CIO, the conflict between DevSecOps and thinking differently about how quick, for example, the Ukrainians, as we were discussing, are moving on software development versus cyber incidents. Now, of course, you don't want a major cyber incident where a lot of personal information or mission data is compromised. But if you're going to empower your software developers to think at speed of mission, there's going to have to be a balance there, and not having folks proverbially taken out back and shot because they took some extra risk. And this is hard, and this is where we as leaders have got to be ready to stand up and say, yeah, I authorize that because it was the right thing to do, and we're going to learn from it and move on. And that is a tough thing in government. And I would argue not only here in the United States, but looking across our allies and elsewhere. And this is one thing I'm going to try to evangelize here at the Bush School is as these women and men who are coming through our program, they're going to start as GS 9s or whatever, or maybe in other parts of private sector, whatever. They're going to be the leader someday, and they're the ones who are going to have to put their name on the blame line on this and say, I authorize this. So that's a big thing that I think about as trying to grow future leaders, is about that risk tolerance, and because if we don't, we are going to get outflanked by the PRC and others. Mm-hmm. That's what concerns me.
So I mean, with the private capital in that context, you sort of alluded to the agility, and I think one of the other sort of important factors is actually just knowledge. So, I mean, it's the knowledge sharing between government and the private sector is now more and more important, particularly where government's almost so big, half the time you don't really know where to turn for internal knowledge. So it's often easier to go and approach some external some external minds. So that's one side of things. But what we've also started to see, particularly with certain adversaries, is almost the military application of private capital. So yes, in state-owned enterprises, investing in IP or taking IP or taking control of IP is probably a better way to describe it, as well as using things like finance and debt as a means of control. Do you see an argument for Western allies following that sort of almost weaponizing of private capital, in addition to just using it for partnership?
I think there has to be a close relationship, and I would want to be careful on anything that veers us away from free market, open competition. But I think it's the same as we did together in the Cold War and all the way back to the Second World War, being able to have the private innovation and capital, and to what Teresa said a minute ago, not on an evolutionary line on many of these technologies, but revolutionary. I think that relationship has got to be key. One thing, John, I read this past week that really stuck with me in the Wall Street Journal, Jim Farley, CEO of Ford Motor, cousin of Chris Farley, the actor, went over to Beijing and I think a few other cities in China to see some of their EV car production. I know electric vehicles here in the U.S. have kind of ebbed and flowed because of recharging capabilities and market demand. But he came back, frankly, I won't say scared, but startled. And he brought 4 different classes of cars that the Chinese have built that are AI enabled, very ergonomic, described by one of his C-suite colleagues in Detroit as having almost an airline first class seat experience. And he brought the cars back and brought them to his headquarters, and he wanted his C-suite to see how far the PRC had come. And I know that's not a national defense application, but they are getting government subsidies. They do have the different labor costs. They're getting heavy investment, and in a way that Detroit should frankly be concerned about being outflanked on this. That was a real wake up. And these are these kind of things I want us thinking about as Western, democratically minded, tech invested leaders, that we also got to be careful that we don't get so fixated on one area that we're going to ignore something. And the biggest thing, John, that has kept me up is the Chinese military innovation that's occurred over the past 20 years. While we and our allies have been in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, and Africa, China has been preparing themselves in the realm of space, undersea, cyber, hypersonics, in a way that we've got to sprint to catch up, and we cannot do this without the private capital. So back to your question, yes, governments can do a lot of the innovation, but if we don't have this sort of relationship you're talking about, I think we're going to stay behind in some key areas.
Yeah. And so, looking forward to the future, I suppose now, like what are the sort of adversarial challenges we're not thinking about, but maybe should be, and where might you see technology mitigating some of those challenges, both for defense and intelligence?
That's a great question, John. I think about the proverbial black swan events. As someone who was in the White House Situation Room on 9/11, we all knew something was going to probably happen that fall, but none of us envisioned 19 terrorists hijacking 4 airliners and flying them into buildings. Although I know, some of my friends, Gina Bennett and others at the agency, were certainly thinking deep thoughts and well ahead of many others on this. That was, I want to say, a low tech event, but I don't want to ignore that. But we are seeing very serious laboratories of technology in battlefields across the world right now, and these terrible killing fields, whether it's in eastern Ukraine, whether what we're seeing in the Mideast right now, there is revolution happening at great pace. And it's, again, not just the Houthis' ability to fire ballistic missiles on trajectories to hit civilian tankers and also to shoot at our Navy ships, but what we're seeing in terms of microelectronics, software development, risk tolerance in the battlefield that we would never take in peacetime. That's where I worry that we as practitioners here are going to miss something big. And I worry that one of my colleagues, and Teresa, I know you worked with him, Jack Shanahan, the former head of the Joint AI Center at the Pentagon, he said the next war may be won or lost in the first 24 hours. And if that doesn't hit you in the gut, I don't know what does. Now, again, and in another term, I talked to my former boss, Deputy Secretary Kath Hicks at the Pentagon. There's also the risk of protraction, where war is not over in 2 weeks. It goes on for months. And it's not existential for either combatant because of nuclear weapons, but a battlefield becomes the Western Pacific or the entire Pacific or Eastern Europe. And my worries there are we going to be able to move with the alacrity as allies? If I can, real quick, there's one example. I'm a historian who got into technology later in my career, and I still read a lot of histories. And if I could share one example that really resonated with me, in a book by John McManus about the U.S. Army in the Pacific, there was a story he told in there about U.S. and allied internees that were kept at Santo Tomas University in Manila. These were not the individuals that were sent on the Bataan Death March, but they were kept incognito in this university campus in the Philippines. And from 1941 to early 1945, they were sequestered away without news, without access to the outside world. And they had gone into the prison camp when our American forces were still wearing the World War I style helmets, carrying older types of rifles, not very advanced radio technology, older tanks. And then in January of 1945, U.S. Task Force 58 shows up off the shore under Admiral Halsey. New types of aircraft appear over Manila. Blue aircraft, the time they've never seen before, with new markings and new weaponry. And then suddenly the U.S. 1st Cavalry Division rolls into Manila, kicks down the gates. The Japanese garrison retreats. And there are U.S. soldiers in new helmets, new uniforms, carrying machine guns that they've never seen. They have Sherman tanks, which they've never laid eyes on, with advanced radios for the era. And my point of all this was the world the Allies had adapted, and those prisoners who had suffered in that camp saw it firsthand. They saw what the proliferation of modern technology had done in a combat situation. My worry, though, John, Teresa, that was over a 3.5 year period. We may have weeks or months to be able to evolve in a modern battlefield. And this is, as we talk about bringing it back to the Bush School, our future leaders here thinking in terms of you're going to have to be conversant on this. Yes, you may write all day long about what's going on in the Israeli Knesset or what's going on in South Korean politics or understanding NATO dynamics, but you better understand what software means. You better understand what proliferated low Earth orbit means, because in the same way Winston Churchill understood the criticality of radar in the Battle of Britain, or President Roosevelt understood how our ships were going to have sonar to thwart U-boats and Japanese combatants, we better be thinking about that technology. And we can't be on the sidelines to this anymore. And all the things about private investment and so on. I guess, in a way, John and Teresa, we're all technologists now, whether one has a computer science degree, a chemical engineering degree, or a history major. We've all got to lean in this together.
Yeah, totally agree. And even people with arts degrees have ideas, so they can bring that to the tech too. One last question. We've talked about AUKUS and our relationships with other countries through allied relationships. What do you see as being areas that we can learn from each other, and particularly around AUKUS? Where can we learn from the other two nations and potentially others that join the group as we move forward?
This is one area, John, I've been so impressed with, both in my intelligence background and DoD. And without getting into classified issues, I'm not sure I would be able to get into. I was always struck that there are key developments occurring in the different nations in the realm of cyber, in the realm of weapon systems. And some of it I would be so pleasantly surprised on. Like, I didn't know you all are researching this, and you're way out in front. And be able to make that connection back to what's going on across the other allies. And it may be not some new fighter jet or missile, but some technology that thwarts an adversary capability or gets something on orbit better and faster, or once it's on orbit, make it more secure. With the creativity, and this gets to the democratic principles we all abide by, the creation that happens in our universities, in our companies, in the private sector. And this is one area I would argue we can go all day long against authoritarian nations and their top-down economic, police state, data collected, social score society they live in. You unleash what we can do together. And that's what I would see areas of, whether it's in hypersonics or intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, countering biometric collection, things that were like, wow, I didn't know we were working on this together. And it gets back to my time as CEO, making sure that information can be shared across time zones and capitals. And even as we look beyond AUKUS being a core, but what's going on with other NATO allies and East Asian allies who share our goals of being able to have open societies, free seaways to be able to have trade through the South China Sea, making space a safe place to operate for our economies and not worrying about predatory behavior there. And then on the economic front, for that matter, being able to have free trade without threat of authoritarian interference. I saw and continue to see a number of things. One thing I have to frankly sometime do on the U.S. side, we can come in as we're the U.S. with this size economy and intelligence and defense establishment. And I've told and mentored a lot of people, you darn well better listen to what's going on with these allies. Our friends in the UK have been doing some of these things a hell of a lot longer than we have. Listen to them. Our colleagues in Canberra have some incredible innovation going on there. And not only in the city of Canberra, but down Adelaide and up in Sydney and Melbourne and everywhere else. Yep. Damn well better listen to them. And then reaching out to other key allies, be they in NATO or elsewhere. That's one thing that I think, turning the mirror on us in the U.S., I love who we are, and we're an extraordinary, wonderful nation, but we better listen and have our folks at the program level not say, look, we got it, we don't need to hear from you. And that is a cultural issue that I am always wanting to imbue in our students and others.
John, I want to thank you. That's been a really interesting discussion today, and very insightful, and just great to hear your perspective from such an astounding career.
Thank you.
And to add to that, we look forward to figuring out how we can collaborate more officially and not just have the conversation today, but think about the future, because I think there's a lot of opportunities. So thank you.
Totally.
Thank you. John and Teresa, thank you so much for having me on with you today. And I want to thank you for all you're doing to enable our success through AUKUS with the private investments and helping us look to the revolutionary transformations and just being great connectors and colleagues here. I'm so grateful to be on with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to this episode of Need to Know, a podcast brought to you by BOKA. If you'd like to help us reach more listeners, please like, subscribe, and rate the show wherever you get your podcasts.